Hi there, and welcome along to this session on getting started with the Bot Framework and Cortana skills. So in the next hour, and it's going to be a super busy hour, we're going to pull together a whole bunch of different Microsoft technologies. We're going to talk about Azure, we're going to talk about the Bot Framework, we're going to talk about Lewis, we're going to talk about Q&A Maker and much more. And we're going to pull all of these technologies together to build our first Cortana skill. We're going to see how easy it is to pull together all of these different services and build a really great conversational user interface for our customers. So my name's James. I work for Zomato. We're a technical consulting group based here in Seattle, Washington. We work very closely with the Microsoft AI team and have done for the last few years. So it's exciting to be here today and get to share some of the experiences that we've had working with these different technologies. I'm also a regional director and many years ago was a software developer right here at Microsoft. Finally, before we jump into the discussion around the Bot Framework, we welcome your feedback. So please ask questions as we go today. If you don't manage to get in a question and something occurs to you later, then of course hit me up on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. Right, so what is the Bot Framework? Well, let's give you a really high-level overview, and then we're just going to jump straight into the code. So what is a bot in Microsoft's Bot Framework? It's just a web service. And the web service that we're going to build today is just a standard .NET 4.6 ASP.NET Web API web endpoint. So there's really nothing special about this code. Now they have full SDK support for both .NET and for Node.js, but essentially we're just building a web service here. So any kind of endpoint that can accept a JSON message is in a pretty good position to be able to interact and serve as a bot. So that's our code. We're going to build a service that can accept HTTP messages. So where are these messages coming from? Well, unlike traditional bot development, it's not coming from Facebook, it's not coming from Slack, it's actually coming from this bot connector service. And the bot connector service provided by Microsoft actually obscures all of the complexity of integrating with the various different channels that you might want to support. And if you look very closely on this slide, right down in the bottom right, you'll see Cortana, and that's the channel that we're going to be focusing on today. So we're not actually going to have to do any hard work at all to integrate with Cortana. We don't need to understand their APIs or their messaging format. Everything is obscured for us through the bot connector service, and we just get a standard message. So when the user types something or enters something into Cortana, it'll go through the connector service, and we're going to get a standardized format of that message. We can get additional channel-specific data, but we don't have to do any of the hard work about integrating with these various providers. So that actually makes building a Cortana skill very, very similar to building any of the other kind of chat interactions along the different canvases that you see there on the right. The other really important part to building a bot is understanding the user's intent. And typically we do that through some kind of natural language processing. And that's where we're going to look at a technology called Lewis today. To help us understand how to interpret those user requests. The other thing that we're going to look at today is a technology called Q&A Maker, which is actually going to allow us to answer really basic questions that the user might have. So we're going to pull together the Bot Framework, we're going to pull together Lewis, Q&A Maker, to be able to build our Cortana skill. And of course, we need to host this somewhere. There aren't any really specific requirements for hosting. It's just, we have to host it so the endpoint of our bot is publicly accessible, secured but publicly accessible. And no surprises there, Azure turns out to be a really great place to host this, and we're going to talk a whole bunch more about that in just a moment. So that's kind of the key components for our bot. So we've got our code, which is going to be running in Web API. It's going to connect up using the SDK to the connector service. So that's how it's going to expose itself through to Cortana. We're going to call out some of the cognitive services, so we're going to provision those and register those in our app, and then we're going to host the whole thing on Azure. So that's the kind of the very high-level view, and now let's just drill into a couple of additional slides before we start looking at code in Visual Studio. So one of the fundamental technologies that we're going to be talking about today, which makes building bots so much easier, is called Lewis, or the Language Understanding Intelligence Service. And this allows us to quite easily work with natural language. What we can do is provide the service with a whole bunch of examples of the kinds of things our users might ask it. And then we can build a natural language model over those examples. So rather than having to parse individual words and understand the structure of a sentence, Lewis can actually classify the request that the user makes into a specific intent that we can act on in code. Once we've built this model, we can expose this as an endpoint, and there are also some really great built-in features to actually maintain that model. We can record new things that the user is asking that we haven't seen before. We can add them straight into the service and improve our model. So, despite being a really powerful, very useful technology, the concepts behind it are actually surprisingly simple. So there are two concepts, and if you understand these two concepts, then there may be a lot of different tabs in the service portal, but you've basically nailed your understanding of this service. So the first one are intents, and intents are kind of like verbs. They represent the action that the user is trying to accomplish. And here are some examples, and I think the examples really make this a lot clearer. So I haven't actually included any of the specifics of the request here. It's just the overall intent. The other part of Lewis is entities, and these are kind of the nouns, I guess, in the sentence. These are the specific instances of the requests that we want to make. So for example, it's no longer who is blank, it's now is who is John, where does Sue work, what is Erica's phone number. And if you think about how this maps to code, well, the intents are basically methods, right? And the entities are going to be variables or parameters into those methods. So if you understand intents, you understand entities, and we're going to give you some more examples as we go, then Lewis becomes pretty straightforward to use. Done. 7 minutes, we're done with the slides. I think this is going to be a good session. Let's jump into Visual Studio, and we're going to show you how to work with the Bot Framework and with the various other services that we need today. Right, so what's the first thing that we need to do when building a bot? Well, a good place to start is Azure and actually provision a bot service. So let's go in and do that right now. So we'll click on the new button. We'll type in bot service. Click bot service preview, click create. We'll let this pane load, and then I'll walk you through the different options that you have when you create a new bot. So first thing you need to do is give your bot service a name. As you can see, there's a DNS entry there. That means this name has to be globally unique. Now, your users will never actually see this name. It's completely obscured, so you can be a little bit technical with the name so you can ensure that it's unique, but you do need a globally unique name there. The next thing you need to do is identify which resource group you want to place it in. You can create a new one, use an existing one. And then here's the tricky one. Here's the question. It's recently been added, which we'll just talk a little bit about. You have two options for hosting this. So the first one is the consumption plan. And this is actually just Azure Functions. And if you think about how you interact with the bot, Azure Functions is a pretty attractive way of working and billing, right? If I send a message to my bot, Azure Functions starts up, processes that message, and then shuts down. So I'm really only paying for the service when somebody is talking to my bot. So it's a really nice billing model. But there is one caveat at the moment, and it's something that the team is working to resolve. But right now, there are no assembly binding redirects in Azure Functions if you're writing .NET code. And if that doesn't really sound familiar, it's not that surprising, because Visual Studio kind of obscures all of that kind of work and automates a lot of it. So if you've been working in Visual Studio for a while and you haven't heard of that term, then don't worry, because you wouldn't have seen it. What it effectively allows the system to do is ignore minor version changes for dependent packages. So if people upgrade their versions of their assemblies, then it doesn't mean that the whole system has to be updated. It'll just keep working. Now, without assembly binding redirects, that does actually complicate .NET development. And while you can create one here, you can create a bot, it'll spin up, it'll work great. As you start to add more assemblies, you'll find, like we did, this becomes a little bit more of a challenging problem to resolve. So again, Azure Functions team is working on that. I'm very excited about Azure Functions as a hosting platform for bots, but right now, be aware before you jump into that bucket that the binding redirect support is not right there yet. The other option is the app service plan, and that's what we're going to be doing today. And the app service plan is just traditional hosting on the Azure App Service. So you're actually going to be provisioning app service plan. So, we've got free options, shared options, basic, standard, premium, all of the standard kind of web app hosting options that you'll be familiar with if you've used the app service before. So they're the two main hosting plans. And some of the background is to when you might choose which over the other. And because it's an app service, we can actually co-host, right? So if you've already got an app service plan, you've already got a web app running out in Azure, you can just host your new bot on that too. Furthermore, because it's just a .NET 4.6 web API, if you've already got a website running .NET 4.6, you can just add an endpoint, add a controller. There's nothing particularly special about the SDK that you would need to use. Now, of course, what I've just discussed just really applies to the .NET stuff. If you're not using .NET, if you want to run it right in Node, then that's a completely separate stack. It doesn't have the same kinds of constraints as .NET does at the moment. So with that all said, let's go and have a look at what these services look like once they're provisioned. And to save us a little bit of time today, I've actually created one already, I think. The wrong resource group. There we go. So this is a brand new one that's just finished provisioning. Now, the thing about the bot service that's a little bit unusual is that the provisioning is actually done in 2 stages. So the first thing that you provision is going to provision your little bot service here, but it's not finished. And there are 2 things that you need to do to finish it. First, you need to select a template. I'm just going to select the basic one here so we can do all the heavy lifting together. But you can actually see that you can actually integrate Lewis and Q&A directly from the template. I'll click next there. And then the next step is to create a Microsoft App ID, which is the identity of your bot. Now, one thing that I would suggest is that you make sure that you've signed in with the right accounts before you go any further. So this button here actually opens up a new tab and a new site called the App Registration Portal, which is apps.dev.microsoft.com. So I think it's a great idea to actually go there separately. Make sure that you're signed in with the right set of usernames and credentials, so you can make sure that all of the resources related to that bot are created under the same account. If you're anything like me, you're constantly switching between accounts, so this can be a little challenging. So let me just finish the sign-in request here. It's always great to get 2-factor during a demo. Actually got a Windows update, which is even worse, just before the demo. So we've had a few little hiccups as we've gone today. So here we are. I'm all signed in now. Great. Now I can safely click this button. I don't have to worry about it being created in a personal MSA or another account that I might have been signed into earlier. So it's creating the app ID. It's created the app now. All I need to do is click this button called Create an App Password. Now, a trick here is that you do need to copy this to clipboard. So I'm just going to press Control-C. 2 things. First, as soon as you click OK, you can never get this password back. You can revoke it and create a new one, but it's gone. The second thing is when I click Finish and go back to Bot Framework, you'll see that it pre-populates automatically the app ID, but it doesn't do the password. So that's why it's super important to paste that to clipboard so we can put it in there now. I click Agree, and then that actually kicks off another resource manager deployment. So depending on the type of bot you've got, it'll deploy different things, but at least it'll deploy an App Insights account. In the case of an Azure function, it's going to deploy a storage account, and that'll just take a few moments to set itself up in Azure. So it's got that kind of slightly unusual 2-phase provisioning model. Right, so we'll let that continue. We'll come back and take a look at that in just a moment. But fortunately, I've already got a whole bunch of code running locally that we're going to look at in the meantime. Now, what I've done here is I've downloaded the sample code. So that's that basic template that we selected in Azure. There's a button there. You can click Download Code. You can download it, extract it, press F5, and you're up and running locally. So it's a super nice developer experience. So let's actually see that in action. I'm going to just press Continue. I have got a little bit of extra code here that we're going to use later, but it's basically exactly the standard boilerplate code. So you'll remember when we were looking at that diagram that we were receiving a message from the bot framework, or the bot connector more specifically. So where is that? So that's here. This is the messages controller. It's a standard API controller. This is, I think, Web API 5.2, .NET 4.6. So it's very mature technology. We don't have to be on any kind of bleeding edge platform to work with this service. And what's happening here is that we're getting a JSON object. We'll deserialize it to an activity. And these notifications that we get from the bot connector come in many different types. So we get messages that users type into the service. We get notifications when users join the chat. We get notifications when people start typing. There's a whole bunch of different notifications that we're going to receive through this endpoint. So the first line of code here is basically just saying if it's a user message, if somebody's actually typed something to us, kick off a dialogue to process and respond to that message. So let's see that in action, and then we can talk a little bit more about what a dialogue is. So I have here the Bot Framework channel emulator. This is available for download from Microsoft. It's basically a local simulated version of the Bot Framework, so we can test really quickly locally. All I need to do is enter the endpoint URL. So this is whatever the address that your IIS Express instance is hosting. Mine's hosting on localhost 3978. And then the endpoint to the controller, which is WAC API, WAC messages. But that can be anything. You can change that to whatever you think is appropriate for your site. Now, because I'm running locally, I don't insert the app ID and app password. I know it's tempting to copy and paste the values that you've just created in Azure. You don't need those here. In fact, it'll break if you put them in there. So let's just click connect. And what we're going to get is a welcome message from the bot saying welcome to the chat. Then we're going to send the bot a message and see what happens. Great, it's welcomed me. I'm going to say hi. And it's just going to echo it straight back with the number in front of it. So the basic template is true to its name. It is a basic template. Let's type another word in here. We're going to say hello. Let's spice things up. It responds back, it echoes it back, and you'll notice the number increments there, and it's going to be important in just a moment. Right, so we're up and running locally. We're debugging our app. We're debugging our bot locally. So let's just stop there and talk a little bit about what's actually happening under the covers. So the first thing is that the message is being sent to the Echo dialog. And you can kind of think about dialogues like you think about screens in a desktop application, right? So if you've got maybe an app that helps your business, maybe there's a home screen and then it goes to a product ordering screen, and then there maybe is another screen for selecting the specific products that you want to order. And each screen has a specific set of commands that it understands and can help the user with. And dialogues are very similar in the bot framework. So each dialogue will understand a specific kind of context for the user and can help the user understand a specific or complete a specific task. So in this case, it's a very simple bot. We've currently only got one dialogue wired up, but as bots become more complex, that's how you kind of componentize that logic and link it together. So let's go and have a look inside the Echo dialogue. And this is kind of the key logic here, right? So we have this method called message received. If we enter the word reset, then we prompt to say, are you sure you want to reset? And then the more interesting one, and the one that we've actually been seeing in action, is these last two lines, post async. It's got a number, and it said, you said, the text that the user provided in their original message. Now, what's interesting here is that we're using this count variable. And this count variable is actually sitting up here on the class. It's a field on the class, and it's actually maintaining the count in between each interaction with the user. And this is kind of important to call out, and that's in fact why we have the serializable label littered through a number of the classes in our bot framework code. What's actually happening here is that the very first time that the user interacts with the bot, it creates a new instance of this Echo dialog. It then processes the user's message, and then it serializes itself to a binary format, and it's being stored. Then when the user comes back, it sends another message. It doesn't create a new class, new object. It actually deserializes the old one and picks up where it left off. So that's why we can actually maintain state, or keep an account of the messages that the user has sent in this variable up here. We're not actually keeping this running in memory anywhere. We're simply serializing it at the end of the response and then deserializing it when we get the next message from the user. This turns out to be a really important concept to understand early on, because the serializer that they use is the binary serializer. And if you're familiar with .NET and you've been around .NET for a while, you'll remember that something that preceded XML and JSON and some of the more modern serialization formats. And it's mostly magic, which is always a bad sign. But most of the time it works very well, and it will just simply serialize all of the fields in your class. Be aware though, if you try and put fields up here that are, for example, a SQL connection, things are going to go very wrong very quickly, because a lot of these kind of network concepts you're not going to actually be able to serialize. You can't serialize a network connection. So be careful about what you put in here. Similarly, the more that you put in here, the bigger your serialization format is going to be. So if you have a whole bunch of cache data up here, that's really going to slow down the system. So be aware of that behavior. Make sure that the types that you choose are appropriate for serialization. The other thing to consider is that you can actually explicitly write to the state service via their REST endpoints. And that's something that we've had some success for. We've been very explicit when we want to actually store state. So we have full control over its serialization, full control over its life cycle, rather than simply relying on the default serialization behavior. So kind of a technical detail in an introductory class, but I think a really important one, and that's something certainly that's kind of tripped us up along the way. So I thought I'd share that. So let's go in and make a small modification and just kind of see the fact that this is working. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the welcome message. Rather than saying welcome you, I'm going to say welcome you to Contoso ride sharing. To run that up, and I'm sure it will surprise nobody to see that in fact works. It was a pretty unambitious change. So let me just reload this. And after just a few moments, we'll see the welcome message pop up. There we go. Welcome user to Contoso ride sharing. Great. So that's our first change that we've managed to complete there. Now, if you looked, or if you remembered at when we were working with the dialogue, we did some very, very basic natural language processing, right? Literally, if the user types this exact word, then we do something. And that's not going to work particularly well, right? People can express their requests in a whole bunch of different ways. So we need a better solution, and as we've discussed, the solution is Lewis. So how do we get started with Lewis? Let's bring that up. So first thing that we need to do with Lewis is create a subscription key. So we can go into Azure, we type in Lewis, search for Lewis, and click on the Language Understanding Intelligence Service, which is its full name. And then we just have to pick a couple of variables to get up and running. So we give it a name, we say which data center we want to run this service in, we select a pricing tier. There is a free tier, which is great to get started with, and then we just pick a resource group. And once we've provisioned this, it only takes a few seconds, we're going to get a key that we're going to be able to use with this service. Once that's done, we actually switch over to a different portal, and we switch over to the Lewis portal, which is just lewis.ai. And when we can start building our app. Now, one of the really cool features of Lewis is that it supports a JSON format for the underlying data that it uses. So that means I can actually import data from JSON, and I can export it to JSON. So all of that intent, all of that entity data that we talked about earlier, it's actually really easy to get into Lewis, out of Lewis, and in fact, we actually version control all of ours because it's well formatted and easy to work with. So let me go in and import a sample model that I've already prepared, just to save us just a few moments. And I'm going to give it a new name here. I'm going to call it Connect Lewis Demo 1 and click Import. So that's going to upload that JSON file, parse out the examples that I've included, and load that up for me to use. So here's the Lewis portal. We get this neat dashboard that shows you which intents are actually being hit by your users. We get this even more neat tab here called Suggested Utterances. So as your app is being used, it's going to record things that it's not quite sure about that users submit. So you can actually very easily add these to your model and improve performance. So we start at dashboard, and then the next tab down is intents, which should be unsurprising, right? Because intents are one of those kind of key concepts for Lewis. So let's actually go through creating an intent together so we can see what's involved. And I'll zoom this in just a little so we can all see it easily. Now, you might have noticed just before I click that, you can actually add a whole bunch of pre-built data. So if you're building an app, a calendar app, a restaurant app, there's a whole bunch of pre-built intent and entity data available. So it's even easier to get started with this service. So let's create a new intent. We're going to call this the Get Price Estimate intent. And what we're going to be building here is basically a Cortana skill where I can ask it how much is it going to cost to use this particular ride-sharing service to get to a particular location. So it's going to be really important for me to be able to ask that question in a whole bunch of different ways. So I've created the intent, and now I need to give it some examples of how I might, inquire about this particular task. So the first one I'm going to do is, how much does it cost to get to the airport? question mark. So now that's the first example. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tell it what the entities are. And I'm going to say the word "the" and the word "airport" are actually entities. And I'm going to call this the location entity. So if you think about when I'm writing the code for this, I need to know where the user wants to go, right? If I'm going to calculate a price for them, I'm going to help them understand how much it's going to cost to use our ride-sharing service, I need to know the destination. And by training Lewis now, it can actually extract that data on my behalf. So that's the first one. I'm going to ask the same question in a slightly different way. I'm going to say, could you give me a price estimate for a ride to the airport? Enter. Again, I'm going to tag the airport as a location, and so on. Typically, I'd add a whole bunch of different ways. Everywhere that I can kind of think of asking that question, I'll add it in here, and that will result in a good model. So the next thing I'm going to do is just click Save. The next tab down is Entities. Obviously, you can see the entity that I've just created. And then we're going to skip a few. We're going to straight down to Train and Test. I want to click Train Application. So that's going to take all the utterance data, the information we've provided about entities and intents, and build that language model that's going to enable our bot to be really responsive to our users. So now I get this neat little testing window. I can actually ask that same question for a price estimate in a way that I haven't before. I'm going to ask it as, how much does it cost for a cab to the airport? And you'll see that over here, it's able to identify that the best intent is the get price estimate intent. And you'll also be able to see that it's correctly identified the airport as a location, right? So my code is going to be pretty straightforward to write now because I know exactly what the user wants and I know exactly where the user wants to go. Now, you might be wanting to ask at this point, or how do you know where the user is at the moment? That's a very good question, and we will absolutely come to that in just a moment. Right, so now that I've trained my application, we're going to publish it. We're going to flick over to Publish. There are a couple of steps here. The first thing I need to do is add a key. It's actually smart enough to go and have a look at the Azure subscriptions that you have under the same account. So all I need to do is remember which tenant my key is under. I guessed well. I'll select the key that I have, click Add, and now that key is associated with this model and I can actually deploy it. The next thing I'm going to do is publish. But before I publish, I'm going to check this box because it's actually a really useful feature. And that's to enable the Bing spell checker. So as I'm sure you're aware, I'm sure you've been aware of these features that both Bing and Google have used for many years now. When you try and do a search term, you don't actually have to spell it correctly, right? It's actually pretty good at figuring out your intent. And that same technology has actually been brought into Lewis automatically through this Enable Bing Spell Checker option. This actually allows Lewis to clean up the user's query, fix all the spelling mistakes or fix the odd grammar before it presents it to the model. So that means that it's going to be more likely to pick the right intent out of the model, and it also means you don't have to train the model with poor grammar or train the model with poor spelling. So we'll definitely do that, we'll check that, and then we just click Publish to Production Slot, and we're done. So now we have a Lewis model that we can very easily work with in our bot. Now, so that's part of it. The other part of building a useful Cortana skill is quite often just answering questions that the users have. And these can be typically very simple questions. So for example, we might just want to be able to build a bot that for our ride-sharing company that answers commonly asked questions like, can I bring my cat with me on my ride? So we're going to do that too. So this is our Lewis model. This is our kind of our full natural language processing model. Q&A Maker is the service we're going to use next, and that's going to help us build just kind of a solution that allows us to answer some of those really basic questions and answers. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to give Q&A Maker our knowledge base a name. Now this service is still in preview, so I don't actually have to get a subscription key yet. It's all just go along to qamaker.ai, sign in with an account, and you're ready to go. I'm going to give this one Connect Lewis Demo 1. Great. And one of the really neat features about Q&A Maker is that it can actually scrape data from a bunch of places. You can point it to a public-facing website. So if you've got an FAQ page, for example, it can grab data from there. you can upload a whole bunch of different formats of documents, spreadsheets, PDFs, Word docs, and it can actually pull out frequently asked questions from that too. But in this case, I'm just going to manually enter the questions that I'm interested in. So I'll just click Create down the bottom here. And I'm going to go in and just bear with me for a moment, grab some of the questions that I'm going to need to paste in. And the main question that we're going to paste in is just that one that I mentioned around how do I work with animals. There we go. Apologies for that. So we're going to copy that out. We're going to click Add a new Q&A pair. So that's the question. And the answer here is animals are not allowed, aside from guide and assistance dogs. So we'll paste that into the answer box. Done. Now, I can very easily from here add more questions. I can import from different sources. I can create different questions, but with the same answer. I can, tweak the model as I go before I release it into a production scenario. So I'm going to save that one question. That will be the extent of my knowledge base for today. I can then flip over to the test option. And if you notice there, I actually asked, can I take my dog with me? So let's see how well this does. I'm going to ask it a question it hasn't seen before. I'm going to say, can I take my cat with me? And it's going to correctly recognize the answer. So it's not just doing a string match. It's actually smarter than that. It's looking at the language and finding the best response. So the other thing that's really cool about this interface is that I can actually update the knowledge base as I go. So I can, if it's getting the wrong answer, I can tweak it. If it's getting, if there are alternative phrasings that I think would be useful, I can just add them directly in line there. So I've got my knowledge base. If I click Publish, I'll get all of the information that I need. I'll get the knowledge base ID, which is in the post URL, which is A8D, whatever. And then I also get the key to access it. So we have 2 steps here. We've just done the LEWIS, which is a model, which is our natural language model. That's going to allow us to understand the inquiries that our users are making around complex operations like price estimates. But then we've also built a Q&A maker model, which is going to just handle all of those annoying little Q&A type scenarios that many bots need to be able to respond to. So they're kind of our 2 setup steps that we needed to take to work with these services. So how do we integrate these into our code? Great question. Well, first, we're actually going to, instead of implementing our own dialogue from scratch, we're going to use one of the dialogues that's part of the SDK. And that kind of tells you how closely related LEWIS is to the bot framework. It's that the LEWIS dialogue base class is actually part of the SDK. You don't have to download or install anything new. So I'm going to uncomment some code here and walk you through what I've just done. So, a couple of things to set up. First, I inherit from LEWIS dialogue, so that wires me up to the LEWIS service. I need to provide the LEWIS service a little bit of information about how to connect to it. So I provide the LEWIS app ID from the LEWIS portal and the LEWIS subscription key from the Azure portal. So that's all of the credential information that it requires. And now you'll notice I'm not actually overriding any methods in this class. All I'm doing is defining completely new methods, but they're decorated with this LEWIS intent attribute. And if we take a look at this one in particular, you'll see get price estimate is the same name as what we added to our intent in the LEWIS portal. So it's kind of doing a match on magic strings. So when LEWIS receives this particular message from the user, it's going to post it up to the LEWIS service. It's going to process it. It's going to figure out what the best intent is, and then it's going to return it to our service. And it's going to automatically map it through to the right method. And in fact, it goes one step further because it's going to take the entity that it finds, if any, and make that available to us as well. So this makes natural language processing super simple. We build a really good model in LEWIS, and then we can write code like this. We can just say, hey, this is the method to call when a user is inquiring about a price estimate. I don't need to understand how they inquired. That's all obscured by the LEWIS model. So let's stick a breakpoint here and see this in action. Here we go. That's all we'll need to do. And I'm going to say, so we're going to jump back into the Bot Framework emulator. We're going to start a brand new conversation, and I'm going to make my request. I'm going to say, how much does it cost to get to the airport? Press enter. And here we go. So we hit the breakpoint. So this has already hit the lowest endpoint, right? It's already classified my inquiry into a get price estimate intent. And then I can have a look in the result to see if there were any entities. And in fact, there were this time. I get a location, and it's going to be a little tricky to see this given the zoom here, but let me see what I can, no, I can't quite see it, but the location is going to be the airport, which is correct. Here we go. I should be able to zoom into this one. There we go, the airport. It also gives us the confidence of the match. So it's correctly figured out the destination for the user's request. It hasn't given us any information about where the user currently is. So I've just hard-coded Las Vegas for the moment. Continue along. I've just built a very simple service in Azure that returns a price estimate given this information. And then we can return that back to the user. So if we have a look at the response that we get in the chat, we'll see we estimate it's going to cost you $54.30 to get to the airport. So it's able to echo that destination back to the user. What's next? Well, that's the bot, right? That is the bot working. The next thing that I want to show you is actually getting this into Azure. So let's go and have a look at the Azure portal. Our bot should be ready to go at this point. So let's bring that bot that we finished up earlier on. And you'll see once we create a new bot, once we've actually finished registering the Microsoft app and the actual deployment steps have completed, this is where we end up. And there are a few things that I'll point out here. First is this big download the zip file button. If you click this, you'll get exactly the same code as that we were playing with locally. So it's a really easy way to start working with this code locally. You can also edit the code online. So if you click this button, it'll open up the Monaco editor, and you can actually start just writing code in the browser, saving it, building it, and deploying it. So that's a super nice way if you just want to start playing around and you don't necessarily want to install everything locally. Other highlights here is that you'll see these tabs up here. And in fact, what's happening here is that there's a combination of technologies here. There's the app service as well as the bot framework. So you can do everything from one location. So these steps are the bot framework steps. We can see all the channels that we might want to work with. We're going to come back to the Cortana channel in particular in just a moment. We can see analytics provided by App Insights, as you might expect, not a lot of usage given that we've just created this. And we can also see some of the more advanced settings. So how we've registered the bot, and also, perhaps a little bit more importantly, this one here, this advanced settings. It's not actually that advanced, and it's worth knowing about because this is actually how you get down to the app service layer. So if you want to restart the app, if you want to change how you deploy the app, if you want to change diagnostic settings, if you want to add app settings, it's all here under advanced settings. And that's in fact what we're going to do here. Let me show you how we can set up deployment. We can use all of the same deployment options as you would expect in an Azure App Service, Team Service integration, GitHub integration. In this case, I'm actually just going to do local Git deployment. And that's actually going to provision a Git repository for me within this environment that I can just push up to. And one wee trick, if you're wondering what that Git URL is, it's just here on the advanced settings page. You get the Git clone URL just here. So this is the one that you can add to your local Git configuration and push up to. Fortunately, I've already got that sorted, so let's do that locally and see the bot in action. And I'll zoom in just a moment so you can see exactly what's happening within this environment. Let me And I'm going to push this to Azure. I'm working on a local branch called Connect. I want to push this into master. So there's a little bit of an odd syntax there. And if I zoom in, you can see exactly what I've done. I've just committed all of the changes that we've just made together, and then I've pushed that up to the master branch in Azure. Now, if I zip out, you'll see that it's been received by that remote repository, and it's actually pulling that code and doing a build over it before it deploys it. So that'll take just a moment. The one thing that I will point out is that if you have multiple CS project files sitting in your solution, then we're going to have to tell it which one to deploy. And the best way to do that is to go into App Settings and just define a variable called project. So if we scroll down here once this loads, here we go. So there's project, and I can just pass it the URL, the path to the CS project file I'm most interested in. Now, of course, you can completely override the deployment script. This is running on app service. You can access Kudu. You can write your own deployment script. But this is just a nice way if all you want to do is change the path to the CS project file. Right, so if we go back to our window, we can see that everything is looking really great. We can see that it has finished pushing up all of the code to Azure, and now our bot is available in Azure. But you're now suddenly thinking, wow, there's 10 minutes left. You haven't even talked about Cortana. So let's definitely do that. And like we talked about right at the very beginning, the mechanisms of working with Cortana are pretty straightforward because the bot framework hides all of it. It handles all of the integration with all of the Cortana endpoints. So let's kind of have a look at what's actually required to get Cortana up and running for our bot. Now, the first thing, there are a couple of caveats around building a Cortana skill. The first one is that it only supports Microsoft accounts right now. So that means you need to be logged into the bot framework portal as a Microsoft account to configure it. And it also means that you need to be logged into Cortana with a Microsoft account to configure it. To actually access this Cortana skill. So that's the first one. Make sure you're using a Microsoft account. The second one is that this is currently only available in the US. So make sure your region is set to English United States to actually be able to access your Cortana skill. So let's see what's required. So I'm going to actually switch over to a different browser. This is actually running under my corporate account, which is a work account. So it's not going to work. And in fact, I can't even configure Cortana with this account. If you find yourself in a similar situation, you can actually add Microsoft accounts. So if I scroll down here and go to settings, you'll see a list of co-administrators that you can add to. So I've just added my MSA account to this particular bot, so I can access it from an MSA account and actually configure Cortana. So here I've switched over. I'm not in the Azure portal anymore. I'm actually in the Bot Framework portal. So that's dev.botframework.com. So as you can see, you can access very similar stuff. It's just different ways of surfacing up the same information. And I'm signed in using my MSA, my personal Microsoft account. So let me just refresh that page, make sure we've got a good version there. And now I can go and click on the Configure Cortana button, and we just have to fill in a few fields here. So the first one that's super important is this one called the invocation name. And this is the name that you're going to provide to Cortana when you want to speak to this particular bot. Now, this is worth experimenting with, right? You want a name that is going to be really reliable, right? So it doesn't sound like another name, for example. It's something that users will remember. Ideally, it's not a difficult to transcribe brand name, because right now the service is only available through voice. Users can't actually type in to use it. So the one that I'm going to pick here is Connect to Service. Now, when this is released to the world, once you've finished building your Cortana skill, this needs to be globally unique. There can only be one pizza bot, for example. So keep that in mind as well. By default, once I load this up, it's actually only going to be available to my MSA. No one else is going to be able to get access to it. I can share it, but it's by default just for me. So I've created a nice invocation name, Connect or Service. And then we can configure some additional information that the bot can return to us. So one of the really neat things about Cortana as a channel is that Cortana knows a whole bunch about you already if you've enabled those features. So it can provide information to us when we're building our skills. So for example, potentially quite relevant for us is that it actually knows your current location. So when we're asking for a ride to the airport, Cortana can actually tell us where the user currently is, which makes that calculation of price all the more easy. So this is where Cortana really shines, is when we can actually start using information that it's collecting about the user. Now, right now, not all data that Cortana collects is available through this mechanism. There's a kind of a short list of data points here. It can tell you what kind of cuisine the user likes, where they commonly are located, their name, their email, but obviously Cortana has a whole bunch more to offer, perhaps down the line. So we're definitely going to want location. We're going to grab some additional information from the Graph API too. So if you're not familiar with the Graph API, that's Microsoft's centralized way of getting information about the user's calendar, about their email, about their work and personal history. So we're going to enable that, and in fact we're going to require the user to sign in before they go any further with our bot experience. There are two options for this. So we're going to choose the first one, which is sign in before they go any further. You can also trigger sign in whenever you like. You can just send a sign-in card. So we're going to trigger sign in at the very start here. We're going to give this a name. And then we're going to paste in some values here. The first one's going to be, and just forgive me when I copy and paste a few things here. We're going to pass in the app ID that we created earlier on. We're going to paste in the scopes. Now these are the kinds of data that we want permission to access. We're going to pass in the auth URL. That's the first stage of OAuth. And then we're going to paste in the token URL, which is the second stage of OAuth. We're going to pass in that client secret that we were careful to record when we created it earlier. We're going to say credentials are in the request body, and then click save. Let me just double check that because it'll be pretty obvious if that doesn't work. Great. So we've configured Cortana now, and that's really all there is to it. We give it an invocation name, and then optionally we can fetch additional information about the user. Now once we've configured that, we can actually go to a Cortana developer portal to do a couple of additional tweaks. And as soon as this is saved, we'll talk about that. But this is a good opportunity. We've just had a question around persistent storage for bots. So one of the really cool features of the Bot Framework is the ability to maintain state. And we saw that right back at the very beginning where you saw the number increment. And that was because it was serializing the dialogue and then deserializing it next time the user hit the endpoint. By default, that's all running against the Microsoft the Microsoft Bot State service, right? And that's a RESTful service where you can stash data. Now that is only recommended for dev and test. And the question is really around, is there a more persistent option? There are a number of different persistent options. You can configure your bot to instead write to services like Cosmos DB and also Azure Storage. And both of those are recommended for a production scenario. One of the really cool features about Cosmos is its ability to geo-replicate. So there are some really interesting things that you can do with the Bot Framework and Cosmos to actually build a more distributed bot for your customers. Right, so we have our Cortana channel set up. We're going to jump into the Cortana dashboard very quickly and just take you through a couple of options there. So there are two key capabilities in this dashboard that aren't part of the Bot Framework site. So the first thing that is important are these buttons down here. So the first one here, Deploy to Group, allows you to add other Microsoft accounts if you want to share this with other people in your organization to test. So you just have to add their personal MSAs, save that, and they'll be sent a link that they have to click on to fully enable it. So they have to opt in as well as you adding them here. The other one is Publish to World, and that'll take you through the process of actually launching your Cortana skill and making it available to anyone with a Cortana device. And that's actually probably a good point to make here, is that now that I've set this up, it's not only Windows 10 that it's enabled for. If I'm signed into my Android device, my tablet, anything that I'm using that same MSA on, as long as I'm signed into Cortana with it, I'll be able to access it. It will automatically adapt the information that is being returned to the form factor of the device I'm using on. So it's a pretty wide-reaching capability. The other capability that I wanted to mention here is debug. If you check this little box here, once it finishes loading, you'll actually see a little bit more information on all of your Cortana devices. And as soon as you do that, you'll actually be able to see the message that's being acted on. You'll be able to see the raw JSON, which is kind of a nice capability as you're starting to debug. And as you can see, it's already enabled for me across all of the canvases that I'm signed into with this MSA. So, pretty easy to wire Cortana up. How do we actually take advantage of it? Well, let's remove our old get price estimate code, comment that out, and uncomment the new and improved awesome version. I actually need to get rid of this one too. We're going to uncomment that. We're going to uncomment that. And then we're going to walk through and I'll share with you exactly what awesome changes we've made. And the last thing is I'm just going to enable that Q&A dialogue. Adding Q&A in is very simple. You just need to provide the Q&A maker dialogue subclass, which has the key for your knowledge base and the ID for your knowledge base. We won't, unfortunately, have time to go into any more detail today, but there's lots of good materials online for that. So how have we updated our service to make it super awesome to work with Cortana? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we can actually get the authorization token that the user has provided once they've done that OAuth handshake when they first log into our service. So that's what's happening here. I'm fetching the authorization token, and then I can actually use that authorization token to go and talk to the graph service. So suddenly I can pull in all of that contextual information about my user that's available through the Microsoft Graph. The other one that is particularly useful is that location information that I requested before. So I just have to look for the user info on the activity, and I can get their latitude and longitude, and I can pass that through to my service. The last thing that I'll point out is that if you want Cortana to speak back to you, not only do you have to put in the text that you want it to show on screen, but you also need to tell it what to say. And that's this other speech or speak property here. Now, you can just put in plain text. I've put in something called speech synthesis markup language, which is an XML dialect that allows you to actually place, for example, emphasis on particular words or gives a little bit more information about how the speech should be synthesized. So we wired up Cortana, we updated our code, so we got a little bit more context about the user so we could create a more personalized response. So the next step would be to commit those changes, push them up into Azure. Given that we're almost at time, I'm just going to use a deployment that I did earlier, and I can show you this in action. I will say again, this is designed for US markets, so using it with a New Zealand accent is always a little bit of a gamble. Of course, you're going to give the guy with the weird accent all of the speech to text demos. That's fine. Let's see how we go. Ask connector.
Hello. I am your ride-sharing assistant.
Great, so I've used an invocation phrase there to start talking with my bot. So I could say something like start connector, talk to connector, tell connector. There's a whole bunch of ways to kick off this process. And now that I'm working with the bot, I can actually start asking it questions. So I can say things like, how much does it cost for a ride to the airport?
James, I estimate that it will cost $52.83 to get to the airport.
So it's able to pull my latitude and longitude. It knows where I'm going through Lewis because I said the airport, so it pulls that out. So it can calculate how much it's going to cost. It's able to greet me by my name because it knows a whole bunch about me from the Graph API. And it's able to speak back to me because I was able to tell it how to respond through audio. And you can see here the debugging information that we had a look at. This is enabled, and you can actually scroll down. You can see all of the details, and hopefully I can zoom in here so it makes a little bit more sense. But you can see, for example, see that it's actually an overlay. So unfortunately, I can't zoom into that, but it showed my location. It shows things like also whether the device that you're using Cortana on has a display, which is actually a really useful feature, especially when you're working with speaker-based devices rather than devices like Windows, so you can adjust the response of the bot. So in an hour, we were able to use Lewis, Q&A Maker, Bot Framework, Azure, and Cortana to build a skill. We're able to pull all of these technologies together to allow us to build something that is aware of the user, who they are, and it was also something that we could do using some of the advanced hosting capabilities on Azure to make it really quick to get out the door. Thank you very much for joining our session today. I'll leave you with a few links in case you're interested in having a little bit more of a look at some of these technologies that we saw today. You can check out the top link if you want to try some of the cognitive services. You can check out the next one if you want to revisit any of the content from Connect. There are a number of great sessions also on Cortana from the Build 2017 conference. And then finally, make sure you check out the AI School. This is the new offering from Microsoft and has some really great pathways and learning opportunities if you're interested in the Bot Framework. I hope you've enjoyed this session. If you have more questions, please do leave them below or reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks for joining me.